Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class on our course on the Pentateuch, and today you can see we are at the Columbia River. We're actually on the Oregon side. We're on the south side of the Columbia River, looking across to the northern banks, which are in Washington State. I bring this up because this is an illustrative example of how the water system works. The Columbia River here is formed from a bunch of different tributaries in Oregon and in Washington and in Idaho further to the east, all of which flow out towards the Pacific Ocean. In the same way, two of the main civilizations that we encounter in the Pentateuch, those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, also are fed by mountainous tributaries that flow into great rivers, which in turn can be used to provide water as well as to irrigate the fields so people can eat. In today's class, we're going to look at the three main regions that form the backdrop for most of the Old Testament. We're going to look first at Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then we're going to spend more time looking at Syro-Palestine, that is the Holy Land in the strict sense. First, we begin on the east in Mesopotamia, home to the great Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations, and before them, Akkad and Sumer. Why is this important? We look to Genesis chapter 11. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and brought them out of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. Where is this Ur of the Chaldeans? Ur was a very ancient civilization close to the Persian Gulf. You can see it's on the Euphrates River, and that introduces us to where Mesopotamia comes into play first in the Bible. Mesopotamia is this land located between the Euphrates River and then the Tigris River, which is the eastern bound. That land in between, in modern-day Iraq, is Mesopotamia. Indeed, the word Mesopotamia comes from the Greek Mesopotamos, literally between the rivers. These two rivers get their water from the mountains of modern-day Turkey, eastern Turkey. All these different tributaries, there's snow in the winter that melts, and the water flows into what otherwise is desert. It's that water in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that allowed the Sumerian and Akkadian, and then later the Assyrian and Babylonian societies to irrigate their fields. Not only were they able to drink enough water, but they were able to reliably irrigate fields to avoid famine. The people of these societies were able to eat stably without having to forage for food, and thus cities were able to be built, and the civilizations could become stable. They didn't have to be nomadic the way so many other societies, especially in the desert, had to exist. On the other side of the biblical world, out west, we have Egypt. Egypt, like Mesopotamia, is a civilization that's dependent on irrigation from a river. In Egypt, of course, it's the Nile River. Let's look at a biblical passage that explains why this matters. We're in Genesis chapter 12. There was famine in the land. The land in this case is the Holy Land and what would become Israel. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, since the famine in the land was severe. Now, why would Abram go to Egypt to avoid a famine? Correct answer, because the ecosystems were different. The land of Israel and Canaan was a land that got its water from rain, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Egypt got its water from the Nile. So if there was famine in Canaan, there still very well might be a healthy, bountiful harvest in Egypt. And so Abraham goes there. And how is the Nile River able to sustain life in northern Egypt, this area near the Nile River Delta, which is where the civilizations that are discussed in the Bible take place? The Nile River flows northward and has two main tributaries. It has the White Nile, which comes all the way from the south, sub-Saharan Africa, Lake Victoria. At high elevation, Lake Victoria itself is fed by a bunch of different tributaries from Central Africa. The water would flow from Lake Victoria down in elevation, but north through Sudan and eventually into Egypt. But the Blue Nile produced much more water in an average year. The Blue Nile flows through Ethiopia, fed by monsoons that occur between August and October and come off of the Indian Ocean. So you have two tributaries to the Nile River, the White Nile, which comes from the south, and the Blue Nile, which comes from the east. The two rivers meet in the modern city of Khartoum, which is the capital of today's Sudan. Importantly, the Nile would flood every year between August and October. Those monsoons would come in and the Nile would crest and the river would flood. And that flooding would allow the fields to be irrigated in Egypt. All of this is backdrop to what happens in Syro-Palestine, in the Holy Land, properly speaking. First thing we want to say as you look at this map, there are 4 main regions in the Holy Land. I'm going to begin in the west. You can see the Mediterranean Sea is the big body of water we have on the far western side of your screen. First, you can see the faint green color. On the coast, we have the coastal plain. The land is relatively flat. Israel would generally not control this land. That instead was the land controlled by the Philistines in the south, and then further north, the Phoenicians, Tyre and Sidon. As we move to our east, you'll notice there's hills where you can see the towns of Shechem, which would become a significant city in the northern kingdom. Bethel was really the southernmost important city in what would become the northern kingdom. The Mount of Olives, as we all know, is just around Jerusalem. And then Beersheba is the furthest southern part of what would become the kingdom of Judah. All of these are located in the hill country. Then you can see the elevation drops precipitously as we move to our east for the Rift Valley, where the Jordan River flows. You can see the Sea of Galilee in the north of your screen, and the water flows southward toward the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point elevation-wise on Earth. And then once we get to the east of the Jordan River, we have what's called the Transjordan, also very hilly, and it eventually plateaus into desert as we move further to the east. Also note in the south, once you get down to Kadesh Barnea, that's what's known as the Negev, an area that becomes gradually more desert-like. And if we go due south of this map, we're in the Arabian Peninsula. And if we go due southwest of this map, we're in the Sahara Desert once we get away from the Nile River delta in northern Egypt. Unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, Israel got its water from rain. Indeed, the pagan god Baal, the Canaanite god, was the god who made it rain. Hence, a lot of the irony when Elijah punishes the people of Israel by closing the heavens so it wouldn't rain. It's an ironic twist saying this idolatry in getting you what you think it's going to get you. Anyway, you'll notice in the map on your left, it rains much, much more the further north you go in Canaan. The further south you go, the less rain there is. But that's not all. The rain is irregular. You can see this graph on your right shows it's a span of 30 years from 1920 to 1950. It's just a sample of years of annual rainfall. You can see the discrepancies in the annual rainfall totals. And it's not just how much rain they got, but when did they get it. Israel grew its crops in an opposite calendar from what we have in the United States. Instead of planting in the spring and harvesting in the fall, Israel would plant in the fall when the rains would begin. The summer is the driest season in Israel. There's hardly any rain, if any at all. The rains would begin around October to soften the ground. They'd be able to plant. The rainiest month is January, and then the rains would stop around March, April, and that would be the harvest season, April, May. And so Israel was dependent not just on that they would get enough rain in a year, but that the rain would happen at the right time so they would be able to plant their crops early and that the harvest would not be damaged. So this was a society that was heavily dependent upon rain. So this is important context for a lot of what we read in the Bible. It's written by people who wondered where their next meal was going to come from. And they realized they were dependent on rainfall. They were dependent on water. If they didn't have it, they would starve to death. That explains a lot of the religiosity and even the religious practice of Israel. Much of the calendar of feasts that we encounter in the Pentateuch are predicated on this agricultural calendar. Let's look at an example of why this is important. We look in Deuteronomy chapter 11. If then you truly listen to my commandments, which I give you today, loving and serving the Lord your God with your whole heart and your whole being, this is classic Deuteronomistic theology. We'll talk about this later this semester. I will give the seasonal rain to your land, the early rain and the late rain, that you may have your grain, wine, and oil to gather in, and I will bring forth grass in your fields for your animals. So notice the attention here. It's not just that you're going to get rain, but you need the early rain and the late rain. Indeed, in biblical Hebrew, all three of those terms, seasonal rain, early rain, and late rain, those are different words. Hebrew had a different word for them because they were that important. They needed to be distinguished. So you can see, geography may not seem all that relevant to the Bible, but it is absolutely central to understanding the context of what we're reading in the Pentateuch. In our next class, we'll look at the literary context and the literary artistry of what we read in these wonderful books. Till then, read well.